Hi students, this lecture is going to cover chapter 5. I think I misspoke at the end of the last lecture and said it's lesson 5. This is actually lesson 4, but we're jumping to chapter 5 for the content of lesson 4. Okay, so chapter 5 is a big chapter in cultural anthropology. It explains a whole lot of complex things about the way human beings have survived and continue to survive on this planet for all of the millennia that we've been here. Chapter 5 is called Making a Living, and we'll talk about what that means to an anthropologist in just a second. But I want to prep you first to know that this chapter I'm going to break down into two different sections, two different lessons, that is, because it's so huge. We've just come off of chapter 3 where we learned about the enculturation process, and we learned about how we practice anthropology, participant observation, and we learned the difference between cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. So now we're getting more into the meat of the different ways of life that people have around the world today and historically also. We're going to do a little bit of history, human history in this lesson. But what you need to do is remember the definitions and the processes that are involved in the enculturation process that we learned about, and learn about and remember about how cultural relativism is really the best way for an anthropologist, the best mindset for an anthropologist to have when we're studying other cultures, because that way we can put ourselves in the shoes of somebody in another culture to better understand that way of life. So we're going to be doing a lot of that in this lesson and the following lesson, because we're going to be learning about some really very, very different ways of life than you and I are accustomed to. So the content of this lecture and the next one that goes with the next lesson is going to be very important for you to take careful notes on, because Project 3 is going to come from the content of Chapter 5 in the textbook and the content of these lectures. So Project 3 is going to test your higher thinking skills, really. I'm going to be giving you a lot of information about lifestyle, the way a day in the life of a certain type of person would happen in a certain subsistence strategy. I'll give you the definition for that in just a second. That's a key term for Chapter 5. But you're going to have in Project 3 a great big list of descriptions and scenarios. And each of the descriptions and the scenarios are going to go with a different subsistence strategy that we're talking about in this lecture, in the next lecture, and in Chapter 5. So the scenarios and the descriptions are going to be for experiences or the expected way of life that someone in a different cultural background, somebody with a different cultural background for each of these different subsistence strategies, think of them as different cultural ways of life. So Project 3 is going to be about sorting all these jumbled facts and scenarios and ways of life and experiences that I'm going to describe in a big long list. They're going to be all jumbled together, and you're going to have to sort them into the 5 different subsistence strategies that exist. Okay, so there are 5 subsistence strategies, and we're going to cover 2 of them in this lecture, and the next lecture is going to cover the other 3. So your quizzes and your reaction papers for this lesson are going to be broken up like that also. Okay, so whichever subsistence strategies we cover in this lecture, which is going to be foraging and horticulture, you will be tested over or quizzed over foraging and horticulture, and your reaction paper topic should be foraging or horticulture. for this particular lesson. And then the next lesson, when we go over the other 3 subsistence strategies, that's what your quiz questions will be over. And that's the part of chapter 5 that the quiz questions will come from too. And that's the topics that you should use for your reaction paper for the next lesson. Okay, so take careful notes and pay particular attention to the descriptions that I give you in this lecture, because you're going to need it to figure out the complicated, it's a challenging project, project 3. You're going to need these descriptions to figure out the scenarios and calculate and evaluate and analyze the descriptions that I give you so you can sort them into the correct lists. Okay, so let's get started on the meat of this chapter. So this chapter is called Making a Living. And usually for people like you and me, when we hear that phrase, making a living, we think of, at least I think you're thinking of earning money, getting a paycheck, having some kind of every 2 weeks or every month, some kind of money source so that we can pay bills. And in our lives, a lot of the bills that we have are not merely basic necessities. There are basic necessities that we pay for in our bills each month, but a lot of things that we pay for and that we think of as necessary for our style of life is not really necessary for human survival. Okay, so making a living in cultural anthropology, when we use that phrase, we're kind of backing up from the experience that you and I have about making a living equals having a paycheck or having a stipend or having, some kind of income source to pay our bills. We're backing up from that, and we're looking at what are the basic needs that human beings must have to survive from day to day. So the word subsistence that I used a couple times in the introduction to this lecture, that word subsistence, it's a very good college level word for you to just include in your vocabulary in general now that you're in college. Subsistence means to survive from day to day. Subsistence means to survive from day to day with the basic necessities that are a must to survive from day to day. So think about the basic things that human beings need to survive. Definitely food is the first thing on the list. And when you look at the definition of subsistence strategy in your textbook, the authors say that a subsistence strategy is the way people use the environmental resources that they have to get food. I'm going to expand that definition just a little bit more, because we need more than food, don't we? We need clean water. There's another college level word that you can learn here. The term for clean water or drinkable water is potable. We need potable water, spelled just like it sounds. And you Spanish speakers out there, you'll know the word agua potable, that is drinkable water. So we need clean water, we need food, and some of us need, as a basic necessity, clothing and shelter to survive, like a roof over our heads, right? We have a lot of reasons why in our culture we wear clothing, right? I mean, certainly in the winter months, we need lots of clothing on us if we're going to be outside or exposed to the weather at all here in Arkansas, because it gets, cold, it gets rainy, it gets, all of the winter weather that we've got. We need to shelter ourselves from that. And we have rain at all times of the year. But really, the biggest reason that you and I in our lives wear clothing are for the norms of modesty in our society, or the norms of fashion in our society, or any number of reasons. A lot of times we don't really think of clothing or shelter as a survival technique, although or not technique as a survival tool, but they really can be. Now, you might not need clothing to survive from day to day if you live somewhere around the equator or something, or someplace where the weather is really, even and steady throughout the year. You might not need clothing or shelter to help you survive from day to day as an animal. You know, human beings are animals. So as an animal, we might not really need those things to survive from day to day in some regions of the world. But up around the Arctic, for instance, where you would die from exposure if you were not bundled up enough, clothing becomes a necessary part of subsistence also. So the main focus that we're going to talk about in this chapter is food getting. But please know that for basic survival, which is what subsistence means, we have to have potable water, definitely food, and most of us need clothing and shelter, some kind of permanent shelter in order to survive, okay? So those are the things that are necessary for subsistence. So in this chapter, Making a Living, the descriptions that I'm going to give you and the topics that we're going to discuss are going to focus mainly on how do human beings with these different styles of life, there's 5 different subsistence strategies that we're going to go over. A subsistence strategy is a plan for survival or a plan for food getting, right? So a strategy, the tactics that we use in order to achieve a goal. We need food. How do we get it? There's our strategy, okay? So subsistence means to survive from day to day. What plan do we use as human beings to survive from day to day with one of those key components, food, okay? So there are 5 subsistence strategies. They are foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, agriculture, and industrialism, okay? Those are our 5 subsistence strategies that we're going to cover in these 2 lectures. This particular lecture, we're going to talk about foraging and we're going to talk about horticulture. I'm going in that order because of the population density. Well, there's 2 reasons. Number 1, I'm going to go in that order because foraging is the oldest subsistence strategy known to man. For the majority of humanity's existence on the earth, we have been foragers. That's what got us to present day, foraging. Foraging's not extinct. Foraging is still a subsistence strategy that's practiced by a few groups around the world today. So it's not extinct, but it is the oldest. We used to all be foragers, now we're not. And so the other reason I'm grouping them in that order, foraging and horticulture, is because of the population density or the number of people per area where human beings live, the number of people that the particular subsistence strategy supports. So when you look at the number of calories available to a human being, when you have an increased calorie source, an increased number of calories available, you're able to increase your population size. Okay, so when you have more access to protein, for instance, and fats in your diet, you're able to increase your population size. So look at the vocabulary in this particular unit that's in the margins of your textbook. Look at specific words like efficiency and yield and population density. Those kinds of words are important to understand how cultures or groups of people, social groups of people, expand in numbers as these subsistence strategies change the plan for interaction with the environment to get more food out of the environment. Okay. I'm getting a little bit more complex here than I need to. So let me back up for just a second. So foraging. Foraging is our first subsistence strategy. That means it is one particular plan to interact with the environment that you live in to get food in your belly and in the bellies of people who depend on you. Okay? Foraging is the oldest subsistence strategy. We've already said that. And foraging has another name that perhaps you're more familiar with: hunting and gathering. That phrase, hunting and gathering, is the basic definition of what it means to be a forager. Of course, hunting includes fishing too, trapping things, fishing for things. Gathering is more than just carrying a basket to a blueberry patch and picking berries. Gathering can also be for things that give you protein, like grub worms give you protein, or crickets and grasshoppers, or any kind of, insects could be something that you gather. You gather roots, you gather tree bark, you gather all kinds of things that can be used. Seeds from grasses, like rice is a seed from a grass, or amaranth, which is native to the Arkansas and Mississippi area. All of these things are seeds that you can gather and make staples out of, like corn cakes or something like that, or some kind of breading kind of substance. So all of these things in foraging are hunted and gathered from the natural environment. A forager does not manipulate anything in the natural environment in order to get food for the entire social group. Here's something interesting about foraging. Food to a forager is seen as a natural right that all animals share. So they see the land not as something that people own or even a territory that they occupy. They see the land as the source of life for everything. So for instance, if raccoon is a major source of meat protein for a particular foraging group, then the forager in their enculturation process is going to learn about the life cycles of raccoons, the population density of raccoons, the foods that raccoons eat, some of which human beings eat also, and you're going to be very mindful of how many raccoons you actually hunt and eat in that foraging culture. You don't want to hunt too many. Why? You could really reduce the population density too much, and they couldn't recover, they couldn't reproduce enough to continue to provide you with subsistence. So in your enculturation process, you learn that process about all of the edible plants and animals that are in your area. So foragers would learn about the plants that are available all 12 months out of the year in the natural environment. They would not gather seeds to plant things specifically to produce food for themselves. They do not do that. They gather food during the natural season for that food, and they never manipulate the population of plants or animals in the area. They're very conservation minded, and they don't overtax the natural environment. A forager spends most of their day involved in activities that have to do with the food supply. That does not mean that they're constantly out hunting and gathering. No, that means that during their leisure time, they are making things like arrow points or spear points or atlatls, which is a hunting tool. You can look it up on Wikipedia or something. It's ATL. This is a tool that is a spear thrower. It helps you with more accuracy and more distance and force when you're throwing a spear at an animal that's maybe running away from you. You're spending time making baskets, weaving straw so that you can make a basket so that you can carry things. You're processing those seeds that you have gathered from the grasses that are producing the seeds at the moment, and grinding them or something so that they are useful for the food that you need. You're making a canoe out of a tree that you cut down because that's the best way for you to get fish, is to go on canoe someplace. So in a forager's daily life, yes, you are spending time gathering food daily. You don't put things in a refrigerator and have things pre-made for, a future day. You usually gather most of the calories that you consume in a day. You gather them that day, most of them. Sometimes there's, a holdover for a day or two that you got something, 2 or 3 days ago. But most of the time you gather the calories that you and the people who depend upon you need for that day. And there's no storage of food, really. Also, the children in foraging cultures, the children participate in the food getting strategy as early as they can walk, as early as they can carry things. They are participating in food getting. So childhood has kind of a different definition to a forager than it does to you and me. A lot of people in our society would say, oh, childhood is this time where you play and you don't have any responsibilities. Well, childhood among foraging societies, it might be a time where your responsibilities are fewer than when you reach adulthood, but a child will also participate alongside his or her aunts and uncles, mothers, grandparents, these kind of thing, with whatever activities they're doing, so that they can learn the basics of it and contribute insofar as their strength and stamina can handle. So, if a granddad is flint knapping an arrowhead, their grandchildren are probably around them, the boys at least, learning how to do flint knapping also. If a woman is making a clay pot so that she can gather water from the stream and bring it back to the camp for everyone to consume, probably the girls are with that woman and the other adult women learning how to make those same clay vessels so that they can transport liquids or transport anything. Dry goods also can go in those clay vessels. You find a lot of those kinds of artifacts, pieces of pottery like that in the archaeological record, and arrowheads also. Anyway, so those are the kinds of things that a child is spending their time doing during their early enculturation process. They are learning all the tricks of the trade. They are learning how to identify where the plants are and what season a particular bush is giving this particular thing that you need for, to eat during that particular season. They know exactly where to dig for roots that are very nutritious and edible for the group, and they know exactly how not to take too much so that the plant doesn't have a difficult time recovering from the things that you have taken from it for your survival. Another thing that a forager learns in his or her enculturation process is the fact that not every plant has a use as food. Some plants have uses for technical reasons. For instance, I mentioned cutting down a tree and making a canoe out of it so that you could get food. There's a technical use for a plant. You would learn from the adults, the adult males most likely in your group. You would learn what tree is best, how to identify the different types of trees, what tree is best and can most easily be converted into a canoe and that kind of thing. The atlatls that I mentioned, those are made out of wood, and so you would learn as a child from the adults that you are spending time with during the day how to choose exactly the right branch from exactly what tree and exactly the length that it needs to be, usually the length of your arm, in order to be able to use this as an effective weapon to get food. So there's a whole bunch of activities that are related to survival, related to food, water, and shelter getting that people are involved in daily in a foraging culture that you and I simply do not learn in ours. I've got these 2 great big books, they're like this thick each, that talk about edible plants and animals in Arkansas. I got them from the Old State House Museum gift shop down in downtown Little Rock, and there are hundreds. I mean, the books are like this about edible plants and animals in Arkansas, and it gives you pictures and tells you where the area is, where they're native, and that kind of thing, and tells you how to identify them and all this kind of thing. And these 2 volumes of books are vitally interesting. I mean, or vibrantly, I mean, interesting to me. But if I had been reared in a foraging culture, I would have learned all of that stuff, not in a schoolroom. Nope, that's not how enculturation happens. Not in a schoolroom. I would have learned this stuff from hanging out with the adults that are practicing it on a daily basis, who learned it from their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and everybody else in the social group. I would have learned this from observation. That's what the enculturation process is. We learn from observation and participation in daily life, so that when we are adults, we have all the information that we learned about which plants are medicinal and how to use them, which plants are abortifactants, so because we need to keep population density down, which plants are edible, which are technical, all of these different kinds of uses we learn like the back of our hand in a foraging culture, if that's where you and I came from. Foraging is a society that's really interesting to study from a social stratification sense. Here's another term that you need to know, and I'm skipping ahead. I think this term isn't really introduced to you in the reading until a couple of chapters from now, but the term that you need to know here is social stratification. Social stratification is the layering, the uneven distribution of rights, privileges, property, all of these different things that make us be different social classes in your and my daily life. One of the really, really interesting things about foraging is that social stratification, inequality, is extremely limited and almost non-existent in a foraging culture. Social stratification exists in a foraging culture. In other words, people are not entirely equal to each other. But the kind of social stratification that exists in a foraging culture is called egalitarian. A foraging society is egalitarian. That means that people are almost equivalent with social value to each other, but not quite, because the division of labor that is necessary for survival in society has distinct lines where one group is responsible for one set of things. Typically, they are assigned these type things for survival in a cultural group, and another group of people is assigned other duties in their daily life for survival. Okay, so egalitarian, you're relatively equal, but not quite. Foraging is really the only type of social grouping, so societal makeup, cultural practice, where people are equal or almost equal in a society. This is one of the things that you and I, in our political systems, in our workforce, in our economy, all this kind of stuff, just even in our domestic life with the kind of duties that are assigned between males and females, we are not equal in our culture, and we keep talking about how that's a problem. We keep talking about how we need to be equal. We need to get rid of all this inequality, right? I mean, this is like one of our major political things that we try to work toward. Well, foraging is the only social makeup where equality, we approach equality. It's called egalitarianism. And the reason for this is that everybody in a society, daily, everyone, participates in the subsistence strategy. Everyone has vital roles that they participate in the subsistence strategy. In foraging, social stratification is based on gender lines, where males are typically the hunters and females are typically the gatherers. Males typically do some of or most of the processing of the hunted stuff, and females do most of the processing for the gathered stuff and the cooking, for instance. You know, both groups would participate in cooking. But calories, which are important for survival, calories are being secured by both groups. So even though there are different duties assigned to males compared to the duties that are assigned to females, both of those two groups have really vitally important roles in keeping the entire community alive, keeping the entire community with food in their bellies. So the work there's different work assignments if you're male or female, but both of those work assignments have equal social value. And that's why they are egalitarian. Okay, so when the work that needs to be done in a society has the same social value, even when it's divided along gender lines, like it is in a foraging culture, you've got men and women relatively equal, almost as close to equal as we possibly can be, or possibly have ever been in any observable human cultural system so far. That comes in foraging groups, because the work that people are doing is so vitally important for the survival of everybody in the community. Okay, so the population density of foragers is very low. You intentionally keep your population small in foraging. And this is a strategy that helps you as a group not overtax the area where you're living. Meaning you don't want to over-harvest something so that next year when it's in season again, there's less of it for you to make use of. You also know that you're not the only animal in that area that's potentially using that particular plant or animal as a food source. So you don't take more than the natural population of that plant or animal would allow to sustain the same population density of that plant or animal. Now, some of you might be thinking about the 4 seasons that we experience in a place like Arkansas, or lots of other places in the United States, right? So, you think about the migratory pattern of birds when they leave one area and go to the next. One important thing to note about foragers is that most foragers, almost all, like 99% of foraging populations, are nomadic. Nomadic means that you're on the move and you do not have a permanent village. You don't have a sedentary village. Sedentary means staying in one place. You do not have a sedentary village if you are a forager. So think for a second why this would be. You don't have a sedentary village because of the seasons of the year that might mean that a particular food source you were relying on is not producing what you need, and therefore you have to follow the seasons of the year and migrate south, for instance, to find that particular plant or a substitute for that particular food source that is in season 12 months out of the year. So you don't save food or preserve it for a rainy day. You're gathering food for your daily resources daily. That means 365 days of the year. So in your enculturation process, you learn really complex information about all these migratory patterns and these grow patterns that you're going to need to know why. Not because, you're in the Audubon Society or something, although that's a great thing to be in. Not because of that. You're learning this because you are surviving on that knowledge. You have to have that knowledge to survive. Your entire social group has to have that knowledge to survive. And you slowly acquire that knowledge kind of accidentally simply because you're experiencing it. You're participating in daily life with all the other members of your community. The older ones have a great deal of social value. Even if, you're not as strong as you used to be, you're a guy, you're not as strong as you used to be, so you can't, maybe participate in, the rigorous hunt that has to take place. But the older you are, the more experience you have, and you are like the encyclopedia for the culture. And so foragers tend to look at the elderly as having like even an elevated state from anybody else, because they're the ones that have all of the knowledge and skills that can pass them on, at least through word of mouth, to future generations. So the elderly have, a wonderfully high, elevated position, respect, social respect, prestige, among all of the other people in society. Yeah, so foragers are nomadic because, again, I cannot emphasize this enough. A forager does not manipulate anything having to do with food supplies in the natural environment. They don't plant row crops. They do not catch animals, pin them up, and make them breed with each other so that they can have, a steady supply. They don't do any of that. They allow Mother Nature to control all of that, and they participate with Mother Nature's rules, and they gather food, hunt food for their immediate social group from the stuff that occurs in their natural environment. Okay? So foraging is the oldest subsistence strategy. It is the subsistence strategy period that took place or that allowed us to survive to this point in time. It's really only been since about 12,000 years ago, which is a short time given geologic history. 11 or 12,000 years is not a long time when we're looking at entire geologic history and human history. So it's been only about 11 or 12,000 years ago that archaeologists have determined a difference took place, a change took place in population densities and subsistence strategies. About 11 to 12,000 years ago, sedentary villages started to crop up around the world. Archaeologists have dated the artifacts and the materials that were left behind by those human populations to determine that these villages were sedentary, stayed in one place. That means they were not nomadic anymore. And this change took place because human beings figured out a different way to subsist. Foraging did not go away entirely, not at all. Foraging today is still part of our food supply, our subsistence strategy. Foraging maybe has a different purpose, like maybe now you hunters out there go hunting more for sport or more for social bonding than maybe feeding a family, although a whole lot of students tell me that it was a major part of their upbringing, that their dad and uncles and granddad and all these people, these important people in their personal lives who were big hunters themselves, would take them, whether you're a boy or a girl, it would take you out during your youth and teach you how to hunt yourself. And I've had time after time my students tell me, oh yeah, after I killed my first deer or went on my first duck hunt or something, they got the lecture from their dad or their granddad or somebody who said, now you're able to feed your family. If you ever need to feed your family from the land, you have some of the skills necessary. So we still, to this day, have foraging as part of our daily vocabulary, I guess you would say, for our subsistence strategy, although the purpose of it for us today is very different than it is for a foraging group that survives solely on the resources that Mother Nature provides without manipulating any of those resources at all. Sedentary villages came into the picture when human beings started manipulating populations of plants in order to have some staples that they could produce and quantities, predictable quantities of those staples, so that they could stay in one place and change their subsistence strategy, change their way of life. Okay, so the next oldest subsistence strategy, about 12,000 years ago, is called horticulture. Horticulture is the small-scale production of plants, crops, for human consumption, okay? Now, it's small-scale production, and you're not producing a surplus. Just like with foraging, you're not interested in surplus here. You're interested in subsistence. You're interested in survival. But because you have a more predictable amount of food, because you're controlling it, you're controlling the amount that you are planting, you're controlling the efficiency, the yield from the area that you are manipulating. You're able to stay in one place, and you see population density increase. People are having more children, and the number of people per village or per social group is going up. Now, in horticulture, people do not look at land as something that individual family groups own. They look at land as something that collectively in the community everyone has a right to and access to, and everyone participates. All of the males, the adult males, participate in the food production, the majority of the food production for the entire village. So food is still not something that is considered a commodity or surplus, meaning that it doesn't have a price tag on it. Food is still seen as a basic necessity for survival that everyone has a right to. But in horticulture, there is a communal effort to manipulate certain areas of land to produce food that the entire village will consume and survive on. So regarding social stratification that we mentioned when we were talking about foraging, among horticulturalists, social stratification changes. We don't have egalitarianism anymore. You still have a small enough society where no one is just, really separated from each other, where you've got like really super elites up here, and super lowly, people down here as far as like ownership of things. You still don't have ownership of the food supply, like we will get to in other subsistence strategies. But you've got communal control of the food sources that everyone in the area is going to eat. So in horticulture, sometimes called intensive agriculture, you manipulate the land. You need access to a large area of land because you do not have artificial irrigation, you do not have artificial fertilization, you do not have plows or any kind of beast of burden like an ox or a horse or something to help you manipulate the ground. It's all done by sheer elbow grease, sheer manpower, and it is the men in the culture that are participating in the bulk of the hard work that makes the subsistence strategy work. And so you see, regarding social stratification here, you see men having an elevated status in society, women coming in next because they still have a vital role, but not nearly as essential as the men, since they're the ones who are participating in the majority of the calorie production in a society. And women have more of a domestic function now. They're taking care of the elderly who don't have that same stamina and strength in order to be able to participate with the really hard labor that's involved in planting using the techniques that they use. And they're also taking care of children, and they're processing food and providing for the household and the community. So you see a difference in social stratification immediately with sedentary villages, larger population densities, and men taking control of the most vital elements of the food supply. Women participate also. Foraging is part of horticulture. You're going to maybe go out and trap birds. You're going to maybe go out and gather grub worms. You're maybe going to go out and still fish, for instance, and maybe the women and children will participate in most of that and the elderly, but the men who are producing the bulk of the calories that are needed in that culture, those men have an elevated status, and women, children, elderly, a little bit lower than them. It's still much closer as far as, the inequality that is experienced by people who live in horticulture societies. It's still much closer than you and I can even imagine with the way that our culture is organized. Okay, so horticulture. There are no beasts of burden. You do it all with your own elbow grease. You do it all with hand tools. digging sticks, maybe something kind of like a shovel, but it's probably, especially 12,000 years ago, you're not talking about, a metal blade on the end of a shovel like you and I think of today. You are making digging sticks, maybe something that have looked like maybe a paddle of some sort to us, that you're digging rocks out of the ground. You're felling trees, Felling, felling trees to get rid of trees, to use that land as a crop area. And I mentioned before, you need access to a lot of land. You're not going to farm the entire area of land at once. You're going to farm maybe a little section of it that is large enough to support your community for a 12-month period. You're not going to produce surplus. You're going to produce only the amount of food that your family needs, your community as a whole needs in that 12-month period. And in your enculturation process, regardless of whether you live in a place like Arkansas where it gets really cold in the winter and you and I might think, oh, nothing grows at that time, there are ways that you can produce food in the ground year-round, even when it gets, below freezing for several days in a row, like it does here in Arkansas. You would learn these techniques in your enculturation process because you're not producing surplus. You are producing the amount that you need to survive for that week, that month, that 6 months, that year. Right? So you have a really high level of knowledge about how to gather seeds from your previous year's crops, how to preserve those seeds for use for the next growing season for that particular plant, and you're constantly harvesting, you're constantly planting new things, you're constantly planning ahead for what you need to plant next month, next 2 months, next 3 months, so that you can constantly have these kinds of things available to you. If it gets too cold any particular time for you to be able to produce food, you know that you need to produce as much as you possibly can for those last moments of the growing season, so that you do have a little bit on hand to use for those weeks or couple of months that you're not going to have as much coming out of your garden or your field. Okay. So I said that you need a huge area of land, but you're only going to manipulate, you're only going to plant one particular part of it at a time. So maybe you have a huge area and your village is over here, and the place where you are planting and harvesting is up here, and then you have this entire area all around that is your land also, the understood community property for that particular horticultural group. And you're letting all of the other land, you're leaving it alone. Maybe this little part over here, maybe the last 5-year period, you were planting and using this particular part over here to support your village. But since you don't have artificial fertilizers or any kind of mass-produced fertilizer in order to be able to continue to use that, that land, you aren't going to be able to use it past like 3, 4, 5 years before you're really going to notice your yield go down. The amount of food that's produced by that particular plot is going to decrease, because if you keep planting plants in it, the soil is going to be depleted of nutrients. And so a technique that is used by a majority of horticulturalists is a technique called swidden horticulture. You might know a phrase that is the definition of swidden horticulture, called slash and burn. Now, in anthropology, we don't use the phrase slash and burn anymore, because it sounds like it's really destructive for the environment, and people who are unfamiliar with the process sometimes give it a bad rap, because it sounds like, oh, you're just going in and cutting everything down and so destructive, burning it. But that is not, it's not destructive in the way that horticulturalists practice this, because they're not just slashing and burning huge areas all at once. They're only slashing and burning the next phase of the next field that they're going to need to use in that next 5-year period, so that they're going to be able to support their village. So this is how it works. If you've got enough community property so that you can have 30 different fields. You're not going to need all 30 different fields at once. You're going to use this field for 3 years, and while you're harvesting things from this field for 3 years, you are prepping by slashing and burning this field up here adjacent to it that you haven't even touched for the last 40 years. It hasn't been used by your village for the last 40 years. Well, what happens to a piece of land if you leave it alone and don't touch it, do anything to it for 30 or 40 years? Plants and animals naturally reproduce in that area, and you can have huge trees in that area by the time you come back around to it in 30 years. You certainly have undergrowth, you have large trees, you have birds and animals that have moved into that area and lived their life and defecated and died and decayed, and leaves that have fallen and regenerated and and decayed into the soil. And so one of the benefits of letting land lie fallow, which is what we're talking about here, leaving it alone and not using it for an extended period of time so that it can go back to nature, one of the benefits of this is that is a natural replenishing of the nutrients that that soil needs so that it can be productive and have a good yield and support the population density in your village. So you've left this particular plot of land alone for 30 or 40 years, whatever the cycle is, and you get to it, you need to use it in the next 3 or 4 year period, and you begin immediately cutting the undergrowth, cutting the trees, digging up the root system, and using whatever of those resources are in there. Like maybe you're going to make a canoe out of some of the trees, you're going to make bows and arrows, or, you're not going to just burn everything that you cut, that you slash from ground level, but a lot of it you're going to leave on the ground and you're going to set it on fire. And the ash that is produced from those natural substances is yet another, not just all the plant and animal waste that has accumulated there in the last 30 years, but the ash from the previously living plants and animals that were in there. That is a vital nutrient to the soil. And one of the things the men are going to be doing, not only harvesting and managing the product, the variety of different foods that they're growing, and there's a large variety, a wide variety. They don't just specialize in one thing. Typically, there's a large variety of things that they produce. You are felling the trees, prepping the land, burning it, working that ash into the soil, and getting it ready. And since you're doing all this by hand, it's going to take you a good 2 or 3 years to get the ground ready for you to transition from that plot that you were using to that next one, right? So after the 3 year, 4 year, whatever the cycle is that you've learned in your enculturation process, after you get finished using this one and this one's ready, then you start manipulating this one, you leave this one alone until you get back around to it. You're going all the way over and you're using these different plots of land as you need them, and you'll get back to this other one in 30 years again. And then what has happened to this other one? Trees, plants, animals, grasses, decaying leaves, decaying animals, defecation, all this kind of stuff that adds this wonderful nutrients to the soil that gives you the productivity and the yield that you need to expect so that you can support the population density in your sedentary village. Okay, so in horticulture, you are practicing a subsistence strategy in which the plan for survival is the limited manipulation of the natural landscape so that you can have a predictable amount of food for your population size. The males are typically the ones the able-bodied males are typically the ones who are doing the bulk of the labor that's necessary to support the population. Although every member of society is participating in food production or food processing or food getting to a certain extent, the able-bodied males have the highest position, then females, elderly adults, and then the children who are the future generations of the people who are going to carry on society. That's how social stratification would fall out, right? But people still have relative equality. You don't have differences from one family group to the next. You don't see this family is wealthy and this family is not wealthy. No, in the community setting like this, where everybody participates, all of the family groups are equal to each other. But within that, the gender divide gives, and the work assigned to the division of labor assigned to the genders and the age groups in these cultures, these horticulture societies, that's where social stratification comes in. Okay? There is very little manipulation of the natural environment. You're using natural techniques to fertilize. You're using maybe rainwater reclamation, or you're planting close to a stream, so you have a natural source of irrigation. You don't have complex irrigation techniques. You definitely don't have complex fertilizer techniques or anything like this. You've got hand tools only, so it is literally your own elbow grease that's doing this. You don't have domesticated animals that you are using to help you do the work. That's not part of horticultural society. It's all about human beings with little manipulation of the natural environment to produce a predictable food supply. Okay? With foraging still as part of the food getting strategy, but the production of crops for regular consumption is the majority of what your enculturation process is going to teach you, and the majority of what you spend your daily life doing. Food does not have a price tag. It's seen as a basic human right in horticulture. Okay, let me give you a little note about horticulture here. Anthropology is not the only academic discipline that uses the word horticulture. In anthropology, we refer to a subsistence strategy for human survival when we use the word horticulture. If, for your reaction paper for these two topics on foraging or horticulture, if you intend to look up a source and you just put horticulture in Google or something, you're going to find a lot of different sources that might not be anthropological. For instance, in botany, which is a field of biology that studies plants, they use the word horticulture to talk about like small-scale production of stuff in greenhouses, you know, from flowers to Venus flytraps to anything that's not edible. They'll still use the word horticulture to refer to it. So if you are going to do some research and find an outside source for this particular reaction paper for these topics, you have some higher order thinking skills to use, and make sure that you evaluate. You don't just randomly pick the first thing that Google shows you if you're going to do a web search. You have to evaluate that source and make sure that it's talking about that particular topic the way a cultural anthropologist talks about it. Okay? So read your textbook about these two subsistence strategies at least for this particular unit. That's where your quiz questions are going to come from, and this lecture. And you know, learn about some particular societies that your textbook author describes or introduces to you in the reading, and get really familiar with the differences in these two ways of life that I've just described to you, so that when you get that project 3 later on, when you read a scenario or a description that I give you, you're going to be able to figure out, does that sound like it describes a day in the life of a forager, or does that describe a day in the life of a horticulturalist? Okay, that's the kind of thinking that you're going to have to do for Project 3. And you can do it, okay? And you've got my number, so you can text me with questions. And I will see you next time.